Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Digital Debate Center. Today we're going to be talking about the risk index affirmative. In particular, we're going to be talking about how to do a case debate. Now, for those of you who are like, what's a case debate? I'll tell you. So a case is the affirmative, the 1AC that you've read. And in particular, it's the advantages. And you'll notice up here, we have the human rights advantage, and we have the stability advantage, both of which are the two affirmative arguments available to the varsity division and the junior varsity division that you can read for the risk index. This is in contrast to off-case arguments like disadvantages, etc. So I know we talked about Mr. T, we talked about the structure of disadvantages, the different DAs available. Now we're going to go over how can we win the debate with just our case arguments. Because the thing that's different about this year versus past years is we have a lot of offensive case arguments, meaning that we can win the debate just with the arguments that we've read against the affirmative advantages. So to kind of briefly set up what I'm going to be doing, you'll notice that I have the human rights advantage, I have the 1AC, I have the 1NC, and I have the 2AC. And this is what my flow should look like as a judge when we're going into the 2AC, the second affirmative constructive. Notice that I have identified the evidence names. This is Thrall and Dormini. I put a line under them to signify that that's a piece of evidence. I've written down the tagline and some warrants. And then for the 1NC, I'm flowing in another column. And then for the 2AC, this piece of GUE evidence is responding to these two pieces of evidence. So I'm flowing in columns, I'm identifying evidence names, I'm lining up arguments that respond to each other. So what's the goal of the case debate? What should we be thinking about? We should be thinking about how does the advantage turn itself? Or how does the plan make things worse? And that preparation will start, we're going to think about this from the negative perspective today, in the 1NC. So to briefly review the content of the human rights advantage, we have two pieces of evidence. And the first is the Thrall and Dormini evidence that says that arms sales cause human rights violations. It cites examples in Colombia, Egypt, and Mexico. And then we have a piece of Cup and Morrow evidence that says the US has an obligation to protect human rights because otherwise countries like Russia and China will be emboldened to violate human rights. The 1NC makes one simple argument, which is a piece of Exhume evidence and a piece of Borchevska evidence that say that other countries will sell the recipients of US weapons arms, which is a problem, right? Because that means that they can continue their activities. That means that the same patterns will continue to take place. So if the US doesn't sell Mexico weapons, the negative argues that other countries will sell Mexico weapons because it's not like the cartels are just going to magically disappear, right? Mexico will still have a need for military-style armaments. But let's think about this logically. I've essentially made one argument. Now I have two good pieces of evidence, but I only have one argument. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create what's called a 1NC block. I'm going to do two things. One, I'm going to highlight my evidence. Very basic. And two, I'm going to create analytic arguments. Now, analytic arguments are actually really simple because really they're just arguments that don't have an extended quote from an expert to go along with them. In other words, you get to use your brain to take out the affirmative. Now, why does that matter? One, we're breaking the script, right? Because everyone hears the same arguments every day, and because it's closed packet, we're going to make the affirmative think on their feet, which is good. The second reason is I only have two arguments here, and they're both the same. If I make more arguments that are analytic, I can diversify the types of arguments I'm making. And third, I can use analytic arguments to bolster my pieces of evidence. So let's think of some arguments that we could make. So what's one piece of evidence? So we can attack evidence quality is one type of argument you can make. And we could say their evidence is not qualified. And we might say, first, Thrall and Dramini are from the Cato Institute, which is a libertarian think tank, and obviously they are biased against a strong U.S. foreign policy on philosophical grounds. And then second, the Cupp and Morrow are just CNN commentators. They're not CNN journalists, they're CNN commentators, meaning they just appear on TV and talk about stuff. Doesn't mean they're qualified. So we can focus on evidence quality. We can also just make logical arguments where we can question the warrants of the evidence. So we're going to question the warrants. So one very logical argument that we can make here is to say that the Cupp and Morrow evidence assumes Russia and China will cooperate with human rights. But this is a really self-centered argument, isn't it? Russia constantly jails journalists. There are massive protests. Opposition leaders are jailed. China currently has millions of Uyghurs and ethnic minorities imprisoned in concentration camps in the Xinjiang province. The reason they're doing that isn't because they looked at the United States and they're like, well, the US is supporting Saudi Arabia in a civil war in Yemen, so therefore, I guess I'll imprison millions of people, right? So this is a really biased argument that doesn't assume that Russia and China have their own reasons for doing things. And in fact, it's not going to make much sense for Russia and China to change what they're doing. When the plan happens, millions of people aren't going to be suddenly free in China. Doesn't make sense. So the last type of argument we can look at is to compare a little bit. We can make a comparison. This is generally going to be a prefer my because. Prefer my evidence because. Prefer my arguments because. And here we might say, only my evidence, and we might want to hype up our evidence a little bit. My evidence from Borchevska is from a fellow and an unbiased think tank. My Exum evidence is from the Assistant Secretary of State. So I have political officials and political analysts. They have people who go on TV and some dudes that are paid to hate on US foreign policy, right? So then we have my evidence is better. Now let's also think about what we just did there. So in the 1NC, initially we had two pretty long quotes. But these arguments are fairly quick, right? Their evidence isn't qualified. First, their Thrall and Dramini evidence is from a libertarian think tank that receives funding to hate US foreign policy. B, the Cupp and Morrow evidence are from people who comment on CNN. That doesn't mean they have actual experts. That's really short, right? That took me maybe 15 seconds. That means that I can make 3 more arguments in the space of 30 to 40 seconds, as opposed to reading another piece of evidence, which might take me 45 seconds, I'd only make 1 argument. So ultimately, the 1NC block is going to diversify and expand your arguments. So what should the 2AC be doing here? The 2AC is going to group and go. We're focusing mostly on the negative, but the 2AC is going to say, group the first 2 arguments. They're very similar. They're going to read their piece of evidence, and they're going to answer these one by one. And they'll make an argument here, an argument here, an argument here. Note again how I put a line here to signify that the argument that goes here is responding to this claim that the evidence isn't qualified. So now we get to the crux of today's lecture. In the 2NC or 1NR, how can I win the debate? And there's a pretty simple process that we can follow here. First, we're going to give a bit of an overview. And that overview is going to do a couple of things. It's going to identify my best argument and it's going to explain why, if I win that argument, it outweighs the affirmative. Now, I know we've talked about Mr. T, magnitude, risk, and time frame in terms of a disadvantage against the case. But we can also use it for the plan makes things worse and comparing two different internal link stories. So here, the question is it more likely that countries will stop needing weapons if the US stops selling arms and they'll just won't be able to do anything? Or is it more likely that they will buy from other countries? You would need to give reasons why it is more likely they will buy from other countries and why that would be worse. And we can look at warrants in the evidence. For example, the Borchevska piece of evidence says that Russia doesn't have resale condition or prohibitions, which means that countries that we sell to can then sell to other people we don't like, which would be bad. The Exuma evidence says that, gives an example of China selling countries in the Middle East drone technology that the US has banned internationally. Those are all examples of how the probability of our argument plays out in the real world and how things would get worse. So what else are we going to do? We're going to extend our arguments and we're going to make some choices here. So here's how you extend a case argument. And we extend a case argument in a process that you can repeat for any type of extension. First, we're going to identify the argument. And we're going to do so in terms of number. And we're also going to do so in terms of the name of evidence. So I might say, extend 1 in C1 the Exuma evidence. Extend 1 in C3. And what I'm going to next is I'm going to summarize the argument. And there I'm both going to say the tag, that brief summary of a piece of evidence that appears at the top, but I'm also going to give some warrants. And the warrants could be things like Egypt has bought from Russia in the past when it tired of US preconditions. The Exuma evidence cites China selling drone technology to other countries as an example of how US restrictions end up driving the regimes we sell to other sellers, to other countries. And now we're going to prodight our argument. And when I say prodight, we're going to hype it up. And this is where that argument where you said your evidence is better comes in. My evidence is better because it's from the Assistant Secretary of State. My evidence is better because it cites real world examples. My evidence is better because it's historical. My evidence is better, and we can give 1,000 reasons. And only once we've done those things do we then say our favorite words on the negative. They say, and in fact, if we're being kind of snarky, we might say they just say. And we're going to identify the arguments that they said in response. So they just said the Gway evidence. But the Gway evidence is from a journalist writing for The Atlantic. The Gway evidence is old. It doesn't assume new policies. The Gway evidence is whatever. So we're going to then answer their argument. And then, once we've done to do that, once we're done with that, we're going to conclude our extension by saying, therefore, I'll move so you can see it. Therefore, here's why this argument matters. Which can be summarized as they say X, we say Y, therefore Z. If we win that the Gui evidence isn't qualified, for example, it says that there are obstacles, but doesn't conclude that those obstacles are great enough that countries wouldn't just go elsewhere. If we win our real world examples, that proves that authoritarian regimes would become completely unfettered in their ability to buy weapons. There would be no regulations, and that is worse for human rights. Therefore, the plan makes things worse, and we win the debate. Yes, there are human rights violations in the status quo. The plan worsens them. And we could do this for any of these arguments. But the important things that we want to make sure we're doing are comparing, right? My evidence is better because their evidence is worse because. Talking about warrants, my evidence cites an example of China selling drone technology to Middle Eastern countries. Their evidence says, hypothetically, it could be too expensive. Their evidence is from a libertarian think tank. My evidence is from an official who is intimately involved with arms sales, with the Secretary, or with the State Department, excuse me. So we're comparing, we're identifying our arguments, and finally, we're using our analytics effectively. Because one of the biggest problems with this advantage is Russia and China just aren't going to cooperate no matter what we do. And obviously on the affirmative, we can make other arguments, right, about the strengthening human rights norms, political pressure via the UN. But we're identifying and choosing our arguments, and then we're comparing them, then we're explaining why they matter. So the 2NC or the 1NR can do this. And oftentimes it's going to be the 1NR. So when we're preparing for the 1NR, let's think about what we're doing. So for 1NR prep, we have a lot of time, right? Because my opponent, or my partner, excuse me, is going to prepare for their 2NC, right? They're going to take some prep time. They're going to give their 2NC, and then there's going to be a 2 to 3 minute cross-examination. That means that I have like over 10 minutes to just think about the arguments that I'm going to make. And the good news is, this part can be pre-written. Right? I know what my argument is going to be, right? Because I have 1NC block. So I know the number, I know the name of the evidence. I can summarize my argument because I know I'm going to make it beforehand, right? I can say the tag, I can say the warrants. I can say why my argument is awesome. The only thing that requires you to think on your feet is the number 3 and the number 4. Because number 3 says, what did they say in response in the 2NC, or in the 2AC, excuse me. All of this should be a pre-written block. So for the 1NR, all I'm thinking about is really reading through their evidence and really thinking about why what they said is worse than what I said. So the 1NR is mostly going to be reading through evidence and thinking about stuff like that. You should never take extra prep time. Just doesn't make any sense for us to do that because we had so much time. You're not chilling just like listening to your friend speak, right? You're focused and you're making sure that you have all these arguments ready so that you're just on a roll. Judge, we are going to win that other countries will sell to Russia and China will sell to the clients who buy US weapons. That will be net worse for human rights because there won't be any regulations. Extend the 1NC1, the Zoom evidence, which says this. Here's why it's awesome. They just read this piece of Gui evidence that's not so good. So I'm going to leave this up here, but let's talk about the stability advantage and do a little analysis of it. So remember, we want to have our 1NC block. So let's think about some of these arguments. We can think about evidence quality. All right. So what's an argument we can make about evidence quality? Here's one that's really obvious. The Bazzini evidence is from a professor of journalism. What does a professor of journalism know about geopolitical analysis? Probably not a lot. So the evidence quality, Bazzini is a hack. He's biased, he's not qualified. What's another thing we can say? We can question the warrants of the piece of evidence. All right, so what are some warrants we can question? So let's talk about the spindle piece of evidence. So for those of you who perhaps don't remember, the stability advantage says that there's a civil war in Yemen, and the plan solves this because it puts pressure on Saudi Arabia to stop intervening in the civil war. The Bazzini evidence, number 3, says that the plan forces Saudi Arabia to participate in a peace process. And number 4 says that a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran could draw in great powers and world go boom. So let's think about this spindle piece of evidence. The US has had a security relationship with Saudi Arabia for years, decades. Do we really think that one single plan that changes arms sales and imposes new regulations is going to change things? Probably not. So we could say the spindle evidence talks about Israel, but it doesn't assume the unique situation of Saudi Arabia. So spindle is not about Saudi. All right. What's something else we could say? The De Christopher evidence is from a journalist, but that journalist specializes in economic coverage. He's from CNBC, focuses on business. And if I want to know about Saudi Arabia stocks, I would chat with De Christopher. If I want to learn about the geopolitical implications of a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia, I might look elsewhere. And finally, we want to be comparative. Why is my evidence good? My evidence cites empirical examples of what's happening on the ground. My evidence is from someone who specializes in analysis of Middle Eastern affairs, right? So they don't focus on business. My evidence cites a specific warrant, intelligence sharing, that proves that I'm doing net better here. So now that we've done that, what would we do in the truancy? We would identify our best argument. For me, I think the best argument is the second one that says that if the United States were to withdraw support, the Houthi rebels in Yemen would be further emboldened to carry out human rights violations. So I'm going to say, my overview, I'm going to identify the argument, and then I'm going to say, here's why we win. Because human rights violations will increase, because Yemen will be more destabilized if things continue to occur. And that's more important than what the plan does because X, Y, and Z. But then I would go the line by line and do that same process. I would also do analysis, since here they have access to 2 pieces of evidence on the stability advantage. I would continue to do that type of analysis of comparing, questioning the warrants, questioning evidence quality. And one thing that I might do is I might point out that this O'Connor piece of evidence cites the foreign minister of Iran as its primary warrant as to why arms sales cause Middle Eastern war. Yeah, no wonder the foreign minister of Iran who is fighting a proxy war with Saudi Arabia, doesn't want the United States to sell weapons to its primary geopolitical foe. Why is this person giving an interview in English? Perhaps to persuade Western audiences not to sell weapons. So this is incredible. The land evidence, I think, is a little bit better, but still, the land evidence doesn't assume what the Houthi rebels are doing or something like that. So, one last thing I want to talk about. I can do that over here. Is cross-examination. Some of the best time to make case arguments are in cross-examination. Why? Because you're going to put them in the 1 in R where you have less time to explain things. So you can do a lot of this comparative analysis with cross-examination questions. So cross-ex, we want to use it for case stuff. And one of the reasons we want to do that is for time, efficiency reasons, but also because you know your case arguments ahead of time because you know what their case is going to be. So since we have our playbook, our 1NC block, and they have their playbook, the 1AC, we can start this comparison question early. So what might be an example of a cross-examination question that we would want to ask? And the way we ask a cross-examination question, remember, is in this format. We have a statement, and then we have a question that makes the statement, an argument. Your cup and moral evidence, imagine I am facing the human rights advantage. Your cup and moral evidence says that countries like Russia and China are violating human rights norms. Why would the plan shift their justification for doing so? Well, it's all about strengthening and political pressure via the UN. No, that's not my question. China has millions of people imprisoned in concentration camps. Why do they go free post the plan? And the affirmative might not have an answer for that. The affirmative might have an answer for that. But we're setting up arguments that we can then make in the 2NC or the 1 in R. So logic is a good time, or this type of argument, questioning the warrants of their evidence. Good thing to do in cross-ex. Because it's entirely about the evidence they've read, you're not showing your hand as to what you're going to say. But also evidence quality. This is really useful because judges pick up on questions of evidence quality and credibility because it's really easy for them to understand. So your cup and moral evidence is from a CNN commentator. I get that cup and moral hang out on TV, but why are they qualified to talk about geopolitical events? Oh, okay, they're not qualified? Okay. You're throwing Germany evidence. Let's talk about them. And these are very short, easy questions to ask. They can get you a lot of benefit. And in particular, if you're in the early divisions, novice at JV, most people will not have read the qualifications of their authors. They'll just kind of know the basics of the argument. So if you walk into a novice round, you're like, explain to me the qualifications of this author. You're probably going to do pretty well because they're not going to know. One last thing. Win with kindness. Here, we can really win the debate, right? On the idea that the plan would make things worse for a situation it tries to solve. But we don't want to rack on them too much. We don't want to say their evidence is unethical or anything like that. Instead, we want to focus on their evidence is less qualified, mine's more qualified. Their arguments are hypothetical, mine contain real-world examples. Is that comparison, it's not just they're bad, but comparatively, I'm better is the way to win a case argument. So at the end of the day, if you only remember two things. One, talk about evidence quality. And two, be comparative. Why is what you're saying more logical than what they're saying? And connect it all to say, how's the plan make things worse? Those three things, but whatever. So I'll now have time for any questions if there are any, but we're good to go.